This is just fun. I don't want. Well, good morning, everybody. Thanks for coming today. And for those attending remotely, thank you for attending. I appreciate it. The year's starting out for everybody. Beautiful outside. We have nothing to complain about. No ice storms, snowstorms here. It's very nice.
We are so lucky.
Yeah, we are lucky. My sister's coming out to my house for 9 days. She actually wanted to be out here for a lot longer, but I said no.
We are so lucky.
9 days is a long time. She's a good house guest, but well, anyways, I'm looking forward to seeing her. So today's discussion: fire hardening and defensible space disclosure. So it is one of our most important real estate disclosure requirements, and it's required by California Government Code Section 1102.6a. So we're not doing it just because we want to, it's required. So the official form you'll be using will be the CAR form FHDS, Fire Hardening and Defensible Space Advisory Disclosure and Addendum. Be sure that you use the revision dated June 2025. Now you might ask me how we could possibly use a prior revision. If you use a desktop version of zip forms and you don't update the catalog, then it's very possible you might be using an outdated form and the form has changed dramatically. So we're going to talk about each section of the FHDS form, when it applies, how to respond, and whether you're a listing agent helping a seller complete the form or a buyer's agent explaining it to your client, you need to understand the form thoroughly. So by the end of today's session, you're going to understand this form in its completeness. Took me a while to understand it. So first of all, what is home hardening? It's one of CAL FIRE's primary strategies for reducing wildfire risk. What is CAL FIRE? It's a state agency. That's all it is, right? Something that was created in the state of California. So it refers to using building resistant materials and home features that protect a home from catching fire during wildfires. Hi, Zach. Hi. Why does that matter? Well, flying embers can destroy a home up to 1 mile from an active wildfire. Pretty amazing if you think about it. So that means it can ignite a home from airborne embers long before the main fire reaches the property. The CAR form FHCS is designed to make sure sellers and buyers understand that this risk and are aware of which fire hardening features their property lacks. So if we look at section 2A of the form, there's a statutory notice that reads, this home is located in a high or very high fire hazard severity zone, and this home was built before the implementation of the wildfire urban interface building codes, which help to fire harden a home. So we'll get into the details of that. So it's required language statutorily, we cannot modify it. So the whole idea is just to educate buyers and sellers, especially the buyers. And for homeowners in the fire hazard zones, home hardening significantly reduces the risk of catastrophic fire loss and displacement. It may also increase property value, and it could lead to insurance premium reductions. So that's a benefit, as a matter of fact, right? So the first thing you need to understand is, when is the FHDS form required? It's critical, because if the property doesn't meet the requirements, you don't need to use the form at all. So let's look at paragraph 1 of the form. It has 2 sections, 1A for home fire hardening disclosure and 1B for defensible space compliance. So for section 1A, home fire hardening disclosure, which refers to the vulnerability questions in section 2B, and the retrofit disclosure in section 2C, all 4 of these conditions in section 1A must be met. If you don't meet all 4 of the aspects, you don't need to complete sections 2 of the form. So first, to see if the property qualifies, it must contain 1 to 4 units. It includes single-family homes, duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes, It does not include apartment buildings with 5 or more units or commercial properties. Second, the seller must be required to complete a transfer disclosure statement. If the seller is exempt from a TDS, then sections 2A and 2B are not required to be completed. Also, it includes probate sales, foreclosure sales, and we're talking about exemptions or bank-owned properties. If any of those categories are met, then this form, or at least sections 2, will not be required to be completed. And then third, out of the 4-part test, the property must be located in either a high or very high fire hazard severity zone. So that's critically important. You cannot guess. You must verify that. And how do you verify that? Use a natural hazard disclosure. Or you can use CAL FIRE's hazard severity zone viewer or local resources. And fourth, the property improvement, or excuse me, the improvement on the property must have been constructed before January 1st of 2010. So homes built in 2010 or thereafter do not require this disclosure. Defensible space. There's 2 aspects of this form: fire hardening and defensible space. So for defensible space, if there's a failure of any of the 3 following tests, and section 3 is not required of the form. So only if all 3 conditions are met must you provide the form. So that means if it's a TDS is required, if it's a 1 to 4 unit property, and what is the last one? And if it's a high or very high severity zone. So let's talk about property qualifications again. Let me break it down more clearly. So qualification 1, under fire hardening, if it's not a single family home, duplex, triplex, or fourplex, then it doesn't meet the test and the form is not required. If the seller is not required to provide a transfer disclosure statement, the form is not required. Keep in mind, a seller can actually voluntarily provide the form. So there's nothing wrong with doing that. If for some reason you think the property's in a mountainous area or Trabuco Canyon, it's a high fire zone, even though it may not be required, there's no reason to not provide the disclosure, as a matter of fact. And then third, obviously we want to make a determination if it's in a high or very high fire zone, fire hazard severity zone. And your best resource is the NHD report, as a matter of fact. So don't rely on maps, neighboring properties, or general area reputation. Fire hazard zones are precisely defined by specific property boundaries. And then the property age. If the property was constructed on January 1st, 2010 or thereafter, then it's not going to be required. If it was constructed prior to January 1st of 2010, then disclosure is going to be required. So once again, all 4 conditions must be met for you to be required to provide the form. So exemptions, probate sales, properties sold through probate, bank-owned or REOs do not require the form. Foreclosure properties, bankruptcy sales, and then certain trust transactions. So one from an individual to their own trust, the form is not going to be required. Lease transactions do not require disclosure. However, if it's a lease with an option to purchase, then the form may be required if it meets the 4-point test. So once again, you can still voluntarily provide the form. If you're unsure, there's nothing wrong with providing the form. I think understanding the form will be helpful when you are providing it, though. So we're going to talk about that too. So keep in mind, please be sure to use the form dated June 25th, because there's a complete section with the prior release, which was dated June 22nd, which was not addressed during that prior form release. So if we talk about section 2A, fire hardening statutory notice, once again, the statutory language is fixed and it must read this. This home is located in a high or very high fire hazard severity zone. And this home was built before the implementation of the wildfire urban interface building codes, which helped to fire harden the home. So I would say there's probably a lot of homes that were constructed before January 1st of 2010. So this is not going to be uncommon. So let's talk about vulnerabilities, as a matter of fact. This is talking in section 2B. All we want to do is check yes to the questions that are being asked. So the seller, when answering this section, is not required to explain any of this. They just need to respond. That is their obligation. And the question becomes, if we look at section 2B, is the seller aware of any of these items that make the house vulnerable to fire? If they're not aware, they say no. It's that simple. Let's see. Not only that, but if it doesn't meet the guidelines, there's no obligation of a seller to complete any of these retrofits or any of the other aspects, by the way. It's just their obligation to disclose something of which they are aware of. Section 3, defensible space compliance. This section addresses vegetation management around the property, requires disclosure of local ordinances, and determines who is responsible for achieving compliance. And that could be the seller or the buyer after the close of escrow. So paragraph 3A asks whether the property is subject to a local vegetation management ordinance. Section 3B requires the seller to indicate their compliance status. Section 3C requires buyer and seller to agree on who will obtain compliance documentation. And then section 4, final inspection report disclosure. For newly constructed or fire rebuilt homes in a very high fire hazard zone, the seller discloses whether a final inspection report was obtained. So let's go back to section 2B, Carlos. So now the response is going to be based upon the seller's actual knowledge. So the header says, are you, seller, aware of the following features that may make the home vulnerable to wildfire and flying embers? So the form then lists 6 specific conditions. So let's go through each one. Question 2B, eave, soffit, and roof ventilation where the vents have openings in excess of 1/8 of an inch or are not flame and ember resistant. Why does this matter? Embers can enter attic spaces through inadequate vents and ignite fire, unfortunately, or ignite fire within the insulation and structural components. So it's an entry point for embers. The seller checks yes if they're aware the vents are inadequate. If the seller is not aware if the vents are adequate or inadequate, they would respond no to that question. Roof coverings made of untreated wood shingles or shakes. Why that matters? Well, roofing material that's made out of wood shakes is probably highly subject to fire, and it's highly combustible. So this is based on what the seller knows. If the seller knows that it's a wood shake roof, they would say yes. If they're not aware of the materials used on the roof, they would simply say no. It does not require them to conduct any inspections, climb on the roof, get a third-party inspector out there. This is just simply indicating what they're aware of and nothing more than that. And then 2B3, combustible landscaping or other materials within 5 feet of the home and under the footprint of any attached deck. Well, many homes have plants directly located next to the property. And if it's within 5 feet, it could be an issue that could cause a property to burn down, as a matter of fact, because plant material is highly combustible.
So if you have a tree in your backyard that's
within 5 feet,
and the tree is overgrowing where the branches are almost touching the roof, then
yeah, I would say the answer would be yes, you are aware. But it is, once again, based upon their awareness. Are they actually aware that it's within 5 feet of the property? I think we need to help them understand that, as a matter of fact, when responding to these questions. Single pane or non-tempered glass windows. Well, apparently single pane windows are highly subject and are combustible from radiant heat, and flames can easily enter through single pane windows. So if somebody has replaced the windows, or if they don't know whether they're single pane or dual pane or tempered windows, then we're going to respond no. If we don't know, we're going to respond no. Loose or missing birds stopping or roof flashing, where the roof comes down, if there isn't a board here shielding the interior of the property from birds or other things gaining access to the property, we're going to answer appropriately. If they don't know, then they're simply going to say no. If they're aware that it doesn't exist, they should be saying yes. But once again, it's their awareness. About rain gutters with metal or non-combustible gutter cutters. I don't know how many people climb on their roof to check their gutters, but gutters are subject to fire simply because leaves and other debris can collect in there. If there is a gutter cover, we probably see these commercials all the time, right? Where they're claiming they put something over the gutter covering it and it keeps the gutters clean. I don't know if that's metal or not. If it's not metal, then it's combustible. So it's an issue. And then at the bottom of section 2B, there's an explanation or clarification line. The form says this is voluntary. Unlike the TDS, when you respond yes to something on the transfer disclosure statement, you're required to provide an explanation. However, on this form, if you say yes, there is no explanation required. So you don't have to fill that in. It's voluntary. So once again, the seller has no obligation to investigate the property, climb on a roof, whatever the case may be. If they're not aware, they are not aware, and they would just simply answer no. And then what must the seller do? Well, once again, sellers are not required to investigate the property beyond their direct observations. They don't have to hire a contractor or anybody else to help them respond to these questions. But they do have to respond based upon their actual awareness. So if they live in the home for 10 years and they understand that something is correct on there, they should be responding appropriately, nothing more than that. And once again, no explanation is required, but they are required to answer the questions directly. So here's how I would approach it with a seller. I would say, you're not being asked to hire an inspector or do an investigation. You're simply telling the buyer what you know about the property based upon living here. If you don't know whether something is true, that's okay. You just say no, meaning you're not aware. If you know something is true, then say yes. It's that simple. So it protects sellers from complaints or, let's face it, from litigation, as a matter of fact. And then the list of, and this is kind of funny from my perspective, the form says, list of low-cost retrofits. Nothing is ever inexpensive. I just find it funny that they're using a form of low-cost retrofits. So what we want to do, all we're doing is asking the seller if they have ever completed any of these retrofits. That's all we have to find out. So notice the difference between section 2B and 2C. 2B asks, are you aware of? And 2C says, have you completed? So there's a dramatic difference between those two sections. Now, if something was partially completed, maybe that would require a separate explanation, as a matter of fact. But if it was fully completed, we would simply say yes. If it was partially completed, we would say no with an explanation. What would we say to a seller when trying to fill this form out? Well, if I were explaining it to the seller, I would say the following. We're going through a checklist of improvements, simply improvements, that CAL FIRE recommends. If you've already done any of these during the time you've owned the property, you tell us which ones. If you haven't done any, that's fine. You're not being asked to perform any of the improvements. We're just documenting what you've already completed. So ideally, that removes some of the pressure and confusion that a seller may be feeling when attempting to answer this form. So let's go through the 12 different items. Retrofit 2C1, roof replaced with Class A fire rated roof. If they never replace the roof, then the answer is going to be no. If they replace the roof, it's possible that it may meet today's fire codes, but most likely we would say no.
What's the Class A?
I would just say it's probably a rating issued by CAL FIRE that the roofing material must meet to be given that kind of a guideline. I can't imagine any roofing material now being sold that doesn't meet those guidelines, as a matter of fact. I just don't believe that for a moment. I don't know if what's interesting in the state of California, if there are, toilets, you can't order toilets from out of state that don't meet certain flow rates. The vendor cannot actually sell those products in here if it doesn't meet certain flow rates. So I'm going to make an assumption, maybe incorrectly so, that products today for roofing, if they don't meet certain guidelines, probably cannot even be sold in the state of California currently.
I have a metal roofing. Is that a class A?
You have what now?
Metal. The shingles made of metal.
I'm willing to bet that that would be, yes, a class A metal roof. Yeah, it's non-combustible. If you have a shake roof, well, a lot of homes in Woodbridge have shake roofs or wooden roofs. So obviously those are combustible. Next question, retrofit spaces between a roof covering and sheathing blocked with non-combustible materials, bird stops. If they don't know, most likely, the question is going to be, did you seller make any of these retrofits or improvements? And it's probably likely that most sellers have not completed any of these retrofits.
So now that you mentioned about this, now if it's a condo and the roof is maintained by the HOA and the outside is maintained by the HOA, so you don't replace the roof or manage the trees outside of your thing. So you would just still say no, that like you haven't replaced the roof or you haven't.
I would say no if the roof if it hasn't been replaced. The worst case is if you say no, then it's putting the buyer on notice that none of these things have taken place. Even if the seller is wrong.
Replace the roof, you don't know what material has been put other because it's a condo. That's what it is.
So if you're not aware, just say no.
Because
there's no reason to it. That's the whole point. It's only what you're aware of. You have no obligation to investigate that. Contact the HOA management company to see if a certain type of material was used on the roof that's non-combustible or meets today's standards. So you could always say no, but then if you wanted to offer an explanation that the roof was replaced 2 years ago, there's nothing wrong with that. And maybe it'll put the buyer on notice that, hey, I'm not going to have a special assessment most likely because the roof was already replaced and that's covered in the budget. So there's nothing wrong with adding an explanation if you wish to do that, but you have no obligation to do that. And if you're asked to do that, you have no obligation to respond to a buyer's agent. Remember, just like a TDS, if we continue to amend the TDS, it continues to open up the rescission period in the contract. And this FHDH form is treated just like the TDS in regards to rescission rights. So if we don't deliver this, as we don't deliver TDS when the TDS is required, this keeps a rescission period open for a buyer and they can cancel upon receipt of this form. They're going to have 3 days after personal delivery, 5 days after electronic delivery to cancel the transaction. So that then gives you an idea just how critical this form is during the entire process. But if there's a TDS exemption, this form is not required. Covered chimney and stovepipe outlets with a non-combustible, corrosion-resistant metal mesh screen. Do we really know? I would say no, unless you replace the fireplace and you had those items installed. I'd probably just simply say no, because I really don't know, or I probably can't tell from visually looking at it. Let's see. Vents, install ember and flame resistant vents. Good question. I don't know, so we simply no. We say no, and then retrofit 2C6. Caulk and plug gaps greater than 1/8 inch around exposed rafters and blocking to prevent amber intrusion into the attic or other enclosed spaces. Now, it's possible that a seller, when they see a crack in the wood or somewhere along the eave that there's a gap more than 1/8 inch, if they have actually caulked that, say yes. But if they haven't, or they haven't done that retrofit, the answer is simply going to be no. I think the no answer is really the best way to go about it. I would say just about correct. Exactly. That way, no one could ever say that you weren't accurately disclosing. If you want to add some kind of an explanation, I had the house painted and it's possible that some of these gaps could have been filled, but I'm not sure.
So what's the point to have this form?
What's the point of this form? I don't know. You need to contact your legislators to make it, to give a clear understanding. The purpose of the form is to put the buyer on notice That's when it was taking place. Standards changed beginning January 1st of 2010. So any home built before then didn't meet the standards today. So this is, the whole idea is to put them on notice that it's possible their property could be subject to embers entering the property, maybe destruction by fire or wildfire, that the likelihood might be greater if these certain conditions are not met.
It'd almost be better if they just had a disclosure that, like an advisory form that the buyer just acknowledges and signs instead of going through all this.
Yeah, I would say most sellers have no idea how to answer these questions. I think that's really what it comes down to also. And then if windows were replaced, were they replaced with tempered glass? And is it multi-pane glass? That's something that a seller may know. If not, then the answer is going to be no, same thing. There can be decking. Now, was the decking replaced with non-combustible materials? It's possible. The seller may know. So they went from a wood deck to, I don't know what the materials are called, but it's almost like a man-made type of material. Then they may know that also. There are skylights. If the skylight doesn't have some kind of screen on it, in which the holes are only so tiny, and the seller's not aware, just simply say no, because with an open skylight, obviously embers could enter the property. And this is one that I'm not sure about, maybe Steve would know. Installation of a minimum 6-inch metal flashing applied vertically on the exterior of the wall at the deck to wall intersection to protect the combustible siding material.
No idea.
Okay, all right. He doesn't know. I certainly don't know. So I would say most likely the answer would be no to that. So it's probably fair to say these 12 items, a seller could, if they say no, they're never putting themselves in a precarious position. And then how to determine whether or not the property is in a high or very high fire hazard severity zone. So first of all, the best thing to do is look at the National Hazard Disclosure Report. It's going to tell us specifically if it's in there. All right. And then let's see, there is also the CAL FIRE Hazard Severity Zone Viewer. Don't look at the maps. You can simply type in the address because the property next to you may not be in a high or very high severity zone. And so don't base your conclusion on a neighboring property, as a matter of fact. You can contact a local fire marshal. So once again, don't rely on maps. Don't rely on county or regional overview maps. Don't assume your neighbor's property has the same designation. And then don't base it upon the area's general reputation. And then also don't rely on insurance companies because they use different maps than CAL FIRE. Seems like we could rely on insurance companies, but knowing that they use different maps, obviously we don't want to rely on their representation. So now, once you determine that the property is in a high or very high severity zone and you're meeting the tests, what are the tests? It's a residential property, 1 to 4 units. It's in a high or very high severity zone. A TDS is required. And for home hardening, if the property is built before January 1st of 2010, you have an obligation to provide the FHDS disclosure. If any of those 4 tests fails, sections 2A and 2B do not have to be completed on the form. Now, defensible space, section 3 may be completed, possibly, but if it fails the 3-part test, then the form itself is not required. So the dilemma is going to be, if it is required, keep in mind, and you should remember this up front in the transaction, just like when you're getting all your other seller disclosures, make a determination early on. We want to be sure we deliver this form within the initial 7 days of a transaction. And obviously, if you're representing the buyer, you want to make sure that you're getting this form, obtaining this form. Now, Karam just had a transaction in which he represented the seller, and the TC was saying, we want the AB 38 forms. And it talks, AB 38 references the disclosure that we're describing today for the FHDS. And that's really all it is. If someone says, well, I need all the AB 38 forms, it's simply going to be the fire hazard defensible space addendum or disclosure that we're talking about today. Now, remember, there could be a discussion about if in the event the disclosure is required, will the buyer insist that the seller provide clearance? So the default in the form is that the seller is not going to be obtaining any type of a clearance or providing an assurance from the fire department that the property meets the requirements. So we'll go through the form so we have a complete understanding of that.
So on C, we don't do anything.
On C, depends. If we fail the test for home fire hardening, section 1A, then 2A, B, actually 2A, there's nothing to do. So 2B and 2C are not required. So the test is residential property. Is a TDS required?
Yeah.
Is it in a high or very high severity zone? And was a property built before January 1st of 2010?
Yes.
If we fail any of those four, then 2B and C are not required. You can complete it if you want.
So if you say yes, it's in the residential zone and was built before 2010, then you don't have to do.
No, I'm sorry, maybe I misspoke. If it's January 1st, built before January 1st, 2010, then that I would say that the answer would be yes. So we met that portion of the test. But it's built after January 1st or on January 1st of 2010 or later, then 2B and 2C are not required. And if we go to section 3, section 3 is predicated upon the defensible space compliance requirement, and defensible space versus fire hardening as one last aspect of the test. It's simply, is it a residential property? Is it in a high or very high fire zone? And is a TDS required? So the only difference is, was it built before January 1st of 2010? That's the difference between fire hardening and defensible space requirements. I didn't design this form. I'm struggling with it, so I just want you to be aware. The worst case is you have the form completed to the best of the seller's knowledge, whether it's required or not, and you never have to be concerned about complying or providing this statutory disclosure. So that's another way of looking at it. Now, if we look at section 3A, local compliance requirements, this is one question that differs from defensible space and home fire hardening, because it's asking, is this property subject to local vegetation management, to a local vegetation management ordinance requiring defensible space requirements? So it's separate and distinct. So each municipality, city of Irvine, may have an ordinance for vegetation management. I happen to know that Irvine does not have one. But we don't know, and how do we know? Because if we look at the viewer provided by CAL FIRE, it's not necessarily going to address local municipalities, unfortunately. So we may have to contact the fire department or the local municipality to understand if that local municipality has a vegetation ordinance associated with it. I see the look on your face, Rita.
Yeah, I was like, only contact vegetation manager.
So there's a difference. I just want you to be aware of that. So we're talking about section 3A, local compliance. The property is or is not subject to a local vegetation management ordinance requiring defensible space around an improvement on the property. So regardless of the answer to 3A, if you met the test for defensible space and you had to complete section 3, B, and C, if you complete section 3A, it is independent of 3, B, and C.
And how do we contact this vegetation management?
Well, let's see. I think we just might call the city. So that might be something to do. Or we can call probably the local fire department. And ideally, they could probably give us an answer.
So it wouldn't show up anywhere in that NHD report. Or anything.
It's not going to show up in the NHD report, unfortunately. That NHD report only indicates if it's in a high or a very high severity zone as determined by the state. What was that?
We should update the NHD.
I think that's a good idea. Yeah. So that's a problem. And then section 3. So now we've made a determination in 3A if the property is or is not subject to local vegetation management. We made a determination, Irvine. We said is not. All right. Then section 3B, option 1. The default response is seller is unaware whether the property is in compliance with the applicable state or local defensible space law. So local defensible space law is differentiated from local vegetation management. So I just want you to understand that. Seller does not have a report prepared by an authorized defensible space inspector. And this means the seller does not know if the property meets defensible space standards and has not had it inspected. So when you're completing section 3B, if we have to complete the form, we would check the box under 3A. It is or is not subject to local vegetation management. Section 3B is the default response. The buyer is unaware if it meets requirements. The buyer also has not had an inspection complete, and it's also placing the burden of the inspection on the buyer. So the seller has, if we choose 3B1, seller is unaware, seller's not going to have an inspection completed, and the buyer within 1 year of buying the property is going to have the obligation of having an inspection completed to see if the property is in conformance. So why is that important? Well, if you're the seller, this is great because we're not going to do anything. However, if the buyer now acquires a property and the buyer finds out that, oh, you didn't tell me that I have to have an inspection performed, and not only that, but it's going to cost me $20,000 to have all these trees removed, it's something we should have addressed up front. So that's something I could see happening. But as to any type of repercussions, if a buyer buys a property and they don't have the inspection performed for the very first year of ownership, I'm not aware of any ordinance that's going to impose some kind of a fine on the buyer for not having that inspection completed. Has anybody here had a property in which the seller did complete or have completed an inspection within 6 months of the sale of the property? I'm not aware of anyone that ever has, as a matter of fact. So if I'm a seller, I am not going to choose any options 2, 3.
So under 3B, what do you select?
It's already selected for you.
It's already selected.
Yes. So if you look at the form, that is the default response. It is saying the buyer's unaware. Okay. So that's why I would not get into 3B, 2, or 3. Because I don't know of anyone that's ever had the fire marshal come out and inspect their property. Now it's very possible. And if they have, then we'll respond appropriately or accordingly. But the default response is the buyer's not aware. And guess what? Excuse me. The seller's not aware. And the seller is not going to have an inspection conducted.
And
So the default response for 3B is the appropriate response, in my opinion.
And in 3C also, the default is, what do you do for 3C?
Correct. Correct. 3C1, buyer responsibility, no local ordinance. Buyer shall obtain documentation of compliance with the state defensible space law within 1 year of the close of escrow. So if we allow the default response as the selection, it's placing the burden on the buyer after the close of escrow.
So the only thing to do for 3 is to call up and vegetate your municipality. That's it.
Yes. If we make a determination that the form is required at all.
And then it is required if it's built before 2000.
It will be. Well, if a TDS is not required, then once again, you have an exemption. Yeah, usually TDSs are required.
The buyer can come back and ask you to do this.
They can, as a matter of fact. That's a very good point. During the negotiations, the buyer can actually come back and say, hey, I want the seller to have the property inspected. They can.
That will be their cost.
It would what now?
It would be their cost.
Well, I don't think there's a cost of the inspection. I don't think there's a cost for the inspection itself. It's just the timing, and then more importantly, what's the cost of remediation? Is it in conformance with today's standards? So I think if there's an inspection completed, and I find out as a buyer that it's going to be $10,000 to remediate the issues, I'm probably going to ask the seller to give me a credit, or I'm going to ask them to get a clearance. That's why it's an issue. That no one's doing that, but that's the same thing. If we're representing a buyer and we're just accepting the default response, meaning it's a buyer's responsibility, and somewhere down the road, the buyer has an obligation to comply with the standards today. Maybe it's going to cost them a lot of money, something they never anticipated. And Shweta, why didn't you tell me?
Yeah.
Seriously, non-disclosure.
Isn't the property sale as is? So even those close, if there's a discrepancy, it's sold as is, right?
Well, we're
There's
already
nothing-
addressed, but still disclosure is required. Doesn't matter if
They
you're
don't know.
buying or selling. Well, that's just it. We're saying we don't know.
Right.
The default response is the seller is unaware. So I don't know as the seller, but when we're representing a buyer, we should give a consideration, I would say, because possibly the property may not be in conformance and it could cost the buyer money down the road.
I just had, like in my eyes, was the TC did that. What about the, I mean, I don't think it's required. I'm like, shit, I'm like, I didn't do this now. I'm thinking there's no fire, it's not Mission Viejo, there's no fire hazard out here in my head.
There's no fire hazards there. Oh, very interesting.
No, like my house is not, it's in the Santa Ana, so there's no fire.
Yeah. But I have to tell you, I don't know what the right approach is necessarily when you have a property listed, but I think that what we do want to do is put a seller on notice that they're going to have to complete this form to the best of their knowledge. If they're unaware, the responses are going to be no. So one section is simply just going to be what you're aware of. And then the second section is, did you do any of these things? You have no obligation to do any of them, but if you did, then we're going to respond yes. And then in the event a buyer makes a request, as Steve brought up, to have an inspection performed, now you just have to make a decision. Are you willing to do that? And remember, a buyer cannot, based upon the contractual aspects of the RPA, the buyer cannot have any type of inspection required or actually performed by any governmental agency without the permission of the seller. So keep that in mind, right? If buyer may say, hey, to you, I want to have the fire department out there. Well, without the seller's permission, you can't do that. It's like having a building inspector come out to the property. You can't do that without the seller's permission. So the contract prohibits that. And I don't know how long it takes to get the fire department out there, as a matter of fact.
Sure, they'll come out soon. They'll come out very soon.
Probably on lunch break, as a matter of fact. So now, when you look at the FHDS, if you look at the third and fourth page, there is this so-called decision tree, and I think it even makes the discussion even more confusing. So you can use this as a guide to make a determination how to respond appropriately on the FHDS. Personally, I find it very confusing, but that is available to you. And then section 4, if we can go back to the second page, Carlos, section 4 of the FHDS. So this is applicable in the event, we'll just read it. A property was newly constructed or was rebuilt following damage by a fire, and the construction required a permit, and seller has obtained a final inspection report addressing compliance with home fire hardening recommended building standards as described in Government Code 51182. So this section applies if all of the following conditions are true. First, the property was newly constructed, or it was rebuilt following fire damage. Second, the construction required a building permit. I can't imagine it not. Third, the seller obtained a final inspection report at the time of completion or rebuilding. Fourth, the property is located in a very high fire hazard severity zone. Note that this is very high, not just high. So there's a difference. Fifth, the TDS is otherwise required for the transaction. So all 5 requirements must be met for the seller to complete this section of the form. So just to summarize, go back to the first page, Carlos. Section 1A, home fire hardening, and section 1B, defensible space compliance, are 2 different aspects of the form, 2 different aspects of compliance. So home fire hardening is triggered if it is a single family residence. It was built before January 1st of 2010. It's in a high or very high fire zone, and a TDS is required. So if all 4 aspects are met, compliance with the form is required. If any one of those 4 aspects is not met, you do not have to complete sections 2B and 2C of the form. Would you show 2B and 2C again, please? So 2B, the questions, awareness, and then section 2C is, did you complete any of these retrofits? Defensible space. You do not have to complete section 3 if in the event one of the 3 aspects of the test are not met. So if it's not a single family or if it's not a residential property, remember January 1st, 2010 has no applicability. If there's a TDS required, and then also if it's in a high or very high fire zone, then if it meets all 3 of those aspects, then you must complete section 3 of the form. And then more importantly, this form is just like the TDS. It's required statutorily. And until you deliver it, it gives the buyer an opportunity to rescind the contract. 3 days following personal delivery and 5 days following delivery electronically.
So regardless, you have to put it in.
You should. I think it's just the easiest thing to do. It's just completing it properly. That's about it.
That's the hardest.
Yeah, that's the hardest part.
Yeah.
You know, the worst case is if you complete the form, there's nothing wrong with that.
You just don't know. I don't know.
If you complete the form, and first of all, the seller responds no to section 2B, meaning they're not aware of anything, and then section 2C, saying we didn't do any improvements, even if they did, that's okay. So we've met that requirement. And then section 3, it's already defaulting to this response that's favorable to the seller, meaning it's the buyer's responsibility, subject to the close of escrow, to obtain an inspection report. So it might be the easiest way to manage this, as a matter of fact. Have your client complete it, whether they know or don't know. We give it. We're always going to be in compliance in regards to delivery with this form. Awareness for section 2B, if we don't know, we say no. Section 2C, we can respond no to everything, even if we did any of the retrofits. And then section 3, the default responses are, it's the buyer's responsibility subsequent to the close of escrow to get an inspection. And they assume all costs associated with that.
We still have to select one of these, right?
Yeah, local vegetation management. So that's probably the easiest thing to do is just call the municipality. Fortunately, in Irvine, I've confirmed that it is not subject to local vegetation management.
We have to call the other.
Yep.
What we probably should do is, as
They should have a
someone
list.
collects information, just send it to us and we'll post it on our intranet. So it's available to everybody, so they don't have to go through the brain damage calling each city because we collect the information.
Just ask Mary.
Just ask Mary. She knows everything.
Yeah, that's a good one.
Poor Mary. If you say so, oh, that's great. If she has all those answers, I don't know, Title, if that's something that's available to Title. they would just be doing the same thing that you would be doing. As a matter of fact, I'm calling to find out if it's available. So Maria, did you have something you wanted to share with everybody, by the way? You're on our agenda.
Actually, I did a seminar for new agents last week, or no, a month ago. Anyways, I did a seminar. We started a book club. If you guys want to join our book club, we're only meeting the last Tuesday of the month, but we read a book a month. And this last book that we read was called The One Thing. And so we're meeting today at like right after our meeting here, just to kind of talk about it, like our ahas and stuff like that. But if anybody needs help with their business plan or kind of just ideas, goals, whatever, we'll be in the conference room, and it's, just give you like that little extra pep to kind of start the year off on a good foot.
Yeah, I attended your presentation. I thought it was excellent.
Thank you.
It was excellent.
I got 2 martinis out of it.
Good girl.
Is that it? It was only 2?
Yeah, but if you guys are open to it, or you have questions, I mean, that's what we're here for, is to help each other out.
Well, thanks. That's very nice of you. So my presentation today may have been a little disjointed. It's, I would say this is not an easy form or obligation that we face, but questions for each and every single transaction you're involved in, we can just go through together individually if you have questions about what to do for your specific transaction. So any other questions? Yeah. Yes.
Hi.
Hi, Masood.
I have a question. I just wanted to understand, if let's say seller decides not to, do any of this, or the buyer, had a case, if I send out, let's say, the waivers, for this, would that be saving the client for the future? And if the buyer comes back or anything like that, just want to make sure that they're safe. Later on.
Well, I think if the seller meets the test and must provide the form, we have no obligation but to provide the disclosure. And the buyer then has an opportunity, if they want to make a request for repairs, or they can ask that an inspection be performed. So the seller can simply say no. And the seller has met their obligation simply by providing the disclosure. Nothing else is required of them. It's just, is the buyer willing to go forward under that pretense? I think most buyers and sellers don't really understand this.
Yeah, we don't.
Yeah.
There's no waiver for this one.
There's no such thing as a statutory waiver. So that's the other thing. When it's statutorily required, there is no such waiver for anything like that. It's like if a TDS is required, a buyer cannot waive their rights to receiving a TDS. The seller may never provide it, but they can't waive their rights. And it's the same thing with this form. If it's required statutorily, there is no such thing as a waiver in regards to the statute. Any other questions? Yeah. Okay. Well, thanks for coming, everybody.
Thank you.
You are welcome.
Very happy you're putting my card in.
Oh,
Yeah. Yes.
we forgot about that.
No, I don't